question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to speak on the bill and to follow such a great contribution from my friend, the member for Macnamara, and before him, the members for Bruce and Spence. And as the member for Macnamara said, I think quite rightly, none of us as legislators particularly want to spend time focused on legislation like this, because legislation like this is responding to something that we don't want to see in Australia. We don't want to see division, we don't want to see discrimination and bigotry, and we certainly don't want to see the things that can flow from that kind of way of thinking, that kind of behaviour, which is violence and making people fear violence. That's unacceptable. And I guess at the outset I'd sort of make the point, I think it's an obvious point, that the greatest protection against the violence and other kinds of hateful conduct that can flow from particular kinds of extreme bigotry and prejudice, the greatest protection will not be legislative, the greatest protection will be cultural. The greatest protection is working all of the time, all of us, and every member of the community to fostering, building, maintaining, enhancing the qualities that have generally prevailed in Australia. Tolerance, inclusion, multicultural acceptance and diversity, care for one another, care for broader shared well-being. Those cultural elements and values of Australia are the most potent protections against discrimination, bigotry and the things that flow from them. But we nevertheless need protections, legislative and then the law enforcement parts of Australia's sort of capacity in following and enforcing those legislative precepts to guarantee the safety of the community, and in some ways to reinforce what I said about the importance of culture, to sort of set those normative standards. And what this bill does is take those standards and that capacity for law enforcement to provide that protection further in response to the circumstances that have arisen in recent times. And they have been extremely concerning. And I think as almost everyone who's contributed to this debate has acknowledged, no one in Australia should face the fear of violence or being on the receiving end of other kinds of hateful conduct because of their race or their religion or their nationality or national ethnic origin, because of their political opinion, their sex or sexual orientation, their gender identity, intersex status or disability. Nobody should face the most harmful and extreme kind of discrimination because of their identity, because of who they are. And certainly when we've seen examples of hateful conduct and violence that has at its root cause anti-Semitism, we should be gravely concerned. I mean, anti-Semitism is one of the oldest and most harmful kinds of prejudice that human beings have ever fallen prey to, and that we've seen that in this country. We've seen it more particularly elsewhere, particularly, of course, in the 20th century in the form of the Holocaust. And so we need to be mindful that that kind of discrimination will never entirely disappear, and that when it manifests, when it appears, we need to be clear-eyed about it and respond to it. And certainly Jewish people in Australia should not feel unsafe, they should not feel threatened, and nor should anyone as a result of their membership of a group defined by all of those characteristics that I just mentioned. But if we are genuine in this place, and if we are genuine in our roles as representatives and frankly as community leaders, we do have to make sure that our conduct and our words are consistent with what I said about that broader cultural piece when it comes to peacefulness and non-violence and social inclusion and tolerance. And that hasn't always been the case. I mean, it does concern me that when the events on October the 7th commenced, the terrible conflict in the Middle East that went on far too long and harmed far too many people unnecessarily, that at the outset of that conflict, when people stood up and called for restraint, there were other people, including other people in this place, who said that calling for restraint was wrong. But as if there can ever be a time when someone's speaking up against violence and someone speaking up for a greater and faster move towards the cessation of violence and the return to peacefulness, as if there can ever be a wrong time for that sentiment to be expressed. And while we make these new strengthened arrangements, which are entirely consistent with the approach the government's taken, which, moving very quickly to provide funding for social cohesion, to provide funding to make sure that places of worship are properly protected, to create, obviously, the envoy on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, to bring in the legislation that we did earlier in the Parliament in relation to hate symbology, which was a first, and now to bring along these further strengthened measures. We should remember that what we are trying to combat in general terms is not new. And we should remember that we've seen at various times in Australia's history conduct that is similarly hateful, that is similarly prejudicial. And I do think that as we deal with this particular issue, that it does pay to reflect on other kinds of discrimination that have been present and continue to be present as well. Make sure that we're going to be consistent about those things. Because, the reality is we have seen violence and relatively large-scale social unrest in this country in this century focused on people because of their faith or their national identity. And the Cronulla riots in 2005 come to mind. I mean, this was an instance where you saw kind of wide-scale violence and wide-scale hateful targeting of people based on the perception that they were from the Middle East or that they might be of the Islamic faith. That's, as far as I can recall. Someone has another example, they can make that part of the debate, but as far as I can recall, that would be the most serious kind of prejudicially based violence and civil disorder that we've seen in the 21st century. And there were people at the time who didn't think that was a particular problem. I think Prime Minister Howard at the time said that he didn't think that there was any reason to be concerned about the racialism and the prejudice that was involved in those terrible events. And I think it's worth remembering as we bring in an arrangement that will make sure that hatefulness, the advocacy of violence and the threatening of violence through prejudicial hatefulness against people for a range of general characteristics, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and so on, that we do remember, and we can have the courage to be honest enough with ourselves that the most harmful form of that in Australia's history is prejudice against First Nations people. I mean, there's just no question whatsoever that the history of Australia involves the greatest harm and violence and hateful conduct towards First Nations people than towards any other group. We should be able to be honest about that and apply ourselves to making sure that that kind of prejudice is called out and combated at every opportunity. But, Deputy Speaker, I'll just say about these laws that while I support moves to strengthen the ability of law enforcement to combat, the most dangerous form of bigotry that leads to threats to be made of violence or violence itself to occur to people based on their identity, that we always make these kinds of changes carefully. We should always make these kinds of changes carefully. There will always be a tendency in responding as we should to discrimination and hateful conduct. There will be a risk, I should say, not a tendency. There will be a risk that in seeking to combat a particular problem, we create other issues, and it goes to the point that my friend, the member for Bruce, was making earlier about the balance of things like freedom of speech on the one hand and people's right to live free from fear on the other hand. And that's I think it's responsible. It's perhaps easy in these circumstances for everyone to lean into the part of this kind of undertaking that is about stopping kinds of conduct and enabling law enforcement to focus on people who present harm, to remember that what is almost always involved in these kinds of measures does have the potential to infringe on other freedoms that we regard rightly as being very precious. And we have had laws in the past that were, for instance, around the threat of terrorism, and it's quite right that we took those measures, but when we did them we often said this is starting to move the line when it comes to people's right to have access to legal advice or to not be searched without warrant, and a whole range of other things that are core to our civil liberties and core to the basic freedoms that we have in Australia, that we transgress into those areas very, very cautiously, and we give ourselves the opportunity to look carefully at how they work in operation. We obviously want them to be effective when it comes to combating hatefulness and combating the risk of violence and the application of that kind of prejudice. But if we find that there are these other consequences with respect to people's freedoms and civil liberties, that we reflect and make adjustments as appropriate. And that's why often when we've made these changes, there have been aspects that have involved a review, there have been aspects that have given us the chance as a parliament and as a community to say, is that first and foremost doing the job that we need to do to protect Australians from hatefulness and violence and prejudice, but on the other hand, are there aspects of it that are in an unhelpful way starting to transgress on other important freedoms and liberties that are core to what it means to be an Australian? But fundamentally, Deputy Speaker, at a difficult time when the temperature, as far as division and a lack of cohesion and a sort of a sense that there's this febrile atmosphere that puts people under threat and at risk, particularly recently members of the Jewish community, but not just members of the Jewish community. It's right that government and parliament takes responsible action. As I said, we have done that in a very timely and responsive way at every opportunity over the last 18 months, and we're doing that again now. There have been people who have been part of this conversation who I think frankly at times have not been nearly as much focused on the reality of the problem and the reality of the solution, but have sadly sought to fan the flames of division, frankly, to turn up the heat, to create a more febrile atmosphere, to create a sense of argy-bargy, including political argy-bargy, because they think that suits them. They think it suits them to create that sense of us and them, that sense of chaos. And I hope that people who have engaged in that or might engage in the future reflect carefully, because the truth is that when there's a lot of intemperate, divisive, extreme, aggressive, adversarial language and accusations and behaviour thrown around, it actually produces exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to stop. It actually produces exactly the kind of thing we're trying to stop. And it's incumbent on everyone who is a representative and everyone who's a legislator and everyone who is a leader in the community to practice peacefulness, to practice tolerance, to practice cohesion and engagement and civil respect. And the more that we see that, the less we will need these kinds of changes. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.